Hey guys, it's Juan Chaloa. I'm here to read an article by Kurly Tlapoyawa today. 5 reasons to reject the war on Chicana-Chicano indigeneity or indigeneity. So Curly has his own podcast. It's called Tales from Atlantis. Highly recommend you check this out. He is very, very knowledgeable and stuff. And he also destroys the whole Ablacentric myth. So definitely check out his episodes. I've been following every one that comes out. They're absolutely gripping. And his co-host is Ruben Ariano Placateca. That guy is also pretty awesome. So giving a shout out to them. But I wanted to read this article by Curly. It's really, really good. Curly is an archaeologist. And again, he's very knowledgeable about indigenous history and Mesoamerican history. He specializes in that. So without further ado, indigenous lateral oppression is not decolonization. Sadly, the latest online trend within the Latinx community, and I know it's Latinx, but I'm making fun of it, is to relentlessly attack Chicanos and Chicanos who identify as indigenous. Given the fact that being indigenous is a cornerstone of Chicana-Chicano identity and is manifested in our culture, language, and traditions and blood, I find such attacks curious, to say the least. The basic argument goes something like this: Chicanos, Chicanos, and Chicanx folks do not grow up in traditional indigenous communities and therefore can only call themselves indigenous descendants and not indigenous people. Apparently, there is only one authentic indigenous lived experience, regardless of how history has played out for the Mesoamerican diaspora. This bizarre bit of wordplay ignores the entirety of Chicano-Chicana history and reeks of identity policing at its worst. Interestingly, this assault on Chicana-Chicano indigenous identity is identical to right-wing talking points that seek to deny Chicana-Chicanos our indigenous cultural inheritance. It is certainly unfortunate that a handful of Latinxers and indigenous gatekeepers have taken it upon themselves to police indigenous identity. In doing so, they are sowing deep divisions among people who should be working together. And quite frankly, I think their argument just isn't very well thought out. I completely agree with you, Curly, but I'm going to let you take the reins here. Here are 5 reasons why. One, it completely ignores the fact that the Chicano-Chicano experience is unique to the United States and that the historical racism and colonialist oppression experienced by Chicano-Chicanos has been directly in response to our being indigenous. Absolutely. Absolutely. Just as an aside here, the racism I experienced here in Alabama was because of my indigenous features, was because of my brown skin. One time, I think a commenter on our YouTube was like laughed at me when I was like, I've experienced racism because of being indigenous. He's like, what are you talking about? Because he was operating from that stupid little mind frame of, to be indigenous, you have to only fit this one box and this one lived experience. Otherwise, you're not indigenous. And I was like, no. I was like, think about it. Is it my mixed? Is it because I'm mixed? No, it's not. It's not that. Am I getting discriminated against because I have Spanish blood? No, because if I looked completely white, it wouldn't be an issue. It is because of the indigenous features, the indigenous blood, that I have experienced discrimination. So completely on point. The Mexican American experience in the United States has largely been characterized by our status as a colonized people. Ever since the United States absorbed a large portion of the Mexican Republic as a result of the US-Mexico War, Mexican Americans have been marginalized and ostracized within US society. More often than not, our indigenous roots have motivated this racism. Don't believe me? Let's take a quick look at the historical record. In trying to come up with a solution to the Mexican problem in the years following the US-Mexico War, Mexican Americans were referred to as half-breeds and mongrels by a press that viewed us as the enemy. As Mark Riesler pointed out, the perception of Mexican Americans and the American mindset stressed a dual theme. The Mexicans' Indian blood would pollute the nation's genetic purity and has biologically determined degenerate character traits which sap the country's moral fiber and corrupt its institutions. All right, and then he has a quote blown up here. I'm also going to link this article in the description for you guys. When discussing the Mexican problem in 1929, Glenn Hoover said the following: more Indians have crossed the southern border in 1 year than lived in the entire territory of New England at the time of the Plymouth settlement. This movement is the greatest Indian migration of all time. And unless we think that such racist concept was simply driven by xenophobia against Mexican nationals, let us remember the words of a Texas congressman who noted in the 1920s that the word Mexican is used to indicate race, not a citizen or subject of the country. There are probably 250,000 Mexicans in Texas who were born in the state, but they are Mexicans just as all blacks are Negroes, though they may have 5 generations of American ancestors. During the infamous Sleepy Lagoon trial of the poorly named Zoot Suit riots, A special commission reported the following to the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Mexican Americans are essentially Indians and therefore Orientals or Asians. Therefore, throughout history, the Orientals have shown less regard for human life than have the Europeans. Further, Mexican Americans have inherited their naturally violent tendencies from the Aztecs in Mexico. The report went on to state that the Mexican would forever retain his wild and violent tendencies no matter how much education or training he might receive. We should note that the very name Zoot Suit Riots is a racist misnomer used to distract from the true nature of the riots. Chicano historian and scholar Dr. Ruben Arellano has observed that the Zoot Riots, and I apologize, I'm butchering that, guys, were actually the Sailor Riots because it was they who instigated them and targeted Puchocos, Mexican-American Zoot Suiters. There are a handful of examples clearly showing that our indigenous roots shaped racist American attitudes towards Mexican Americans. And there's a video linked by Kurly here, Chicanos in Solidarity at Wounded Knee, which I invite you guys to check out. Number 2, it legitimizes the racial caste system by perpetuating a racist colonialist mindset in which people are divided by degrees of whiteness. Absolutely. When the Spaniards invaded Mexico, they created a social program known as the Sistema de Castas, a racial caste system that measures a person's social value and degree of whiteness. This system placed Spaniards on the top, Africans and indigenous people on the bottom, and mestizos, half-breeds, which that's another point I keep fighting with people on TikTok and other places where people are like, no, mestizo just means mix. It's like, no. The literal translation of mestizo is half-breed. That's what it is. We have 2 other words in Spanish for mix. It's mezclado or mixto. Why in the world those 2 are never used, I don't know, because mestizo literally means half-breed, like you're a dog. Okay, and you can plug that. You can plug half-breed into Google Translate or mestizo, and it'll translate to half-breed. It'll always translate to that. Not only that, I have a translator down in Mexico City that I run a lot of my articles through, and he has said that mestizo is half-breed down there. So again, it's not just simply mixture like what people think it is. Now, it could have evolved to mean that, but I still think it's such a bad word. There's no sense in perpetuating it anymore. Like, you use the other 2 words for mix. Like, oh, Jesus. Okay. An entire system was established to determine social class by calculating how mixed you were. The idea is disgusting and racist, and sadly still holds a place in Mexican society. Yeah, absolutely, it still does, unfortunately. And here's a picture of the Sistema de Castas. It's really iconic. You can Google this. Proponents of the indigenous descendant argument maintain that mestizos cannot assert an indigenous identity because they did not grow up in traditional communities and are racially mixed. However, this argument ignores the nature of U.S. colonialism and attempts to transfer social norms relating to race and class from Mexico to the United States. While mixed-blood natives certainly experience a level of privilege in Mexico, such concessions are not given in the U.S. to Chicana-Chicano groups. The Sistema de Castas, with its rigid racial hierarchy, associated privileges, and notions of mestizaje don't work within the confines of U.S. racial institutions. Absolutely on fucking point. The fact that I have some Spanish blood has never, ever changed anything for me in this country. I'm going to tell you that right now. So, me going around saying I'm a half-breed, it does me no favors, and it's just stupid, honestly, especially after everything I've experienced. Yeah, no, I'm not going to be doing that. Go back to the article. It is worth noting that the indigenous descent folks lean hard into the mestizo concept and appear to use it exclusively to describe Chicanos. I can't help but wonder if they also cling to other hopelessly outdated racist terms such as mulatto, lobo, morisco, or chino. Do they think that African Americans should continue to be identified as mulattoes, octoroons, or quadroons? Or is this aggression confined solely to Chicana-Chicanos, whom they maintain should only ever be considered half-breeds and never indigenous? We all know the answer to that question. They do not apply these other words to any other races. They don't give a fuck. It always goes back to mestizo, and it always goes back to us. This whole problem with us. Like, now I understand that in Mexico, like how Kurly even acknowledged, you might have a degree of privilege being a mestizo in Mexico, right? You're not fully indigenous, living in the community, blah, blah, blah. I agree. Okay. But the root cause of this issue is the fact that a lot of people don't realize they're indigenous, is this whole separation, this made up separation of, you're not indigenous, you're something better because you're part white. That's what the Spaniards instilled in Mexican society. That's the problem. you take that root cause away and the racism goes away. People start turning back to the roots. They try to re-tribalize, or they embrace their cultures. They try to find all that out, and they don't see being indigenous as a negative thing. Rather, it becomes a thing to honor because it's what your ancestors were. So the whole purpose of my podcast and Nia Marcus's podcast, better said, is we are wanting people to return to those roots. We are attacking the root cause of these problems. Simply crying that mestizos, blah, 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 isn't going to do anything. You have to get people to take, you have to take away that system. You need to destroy that system, the whole concept of mestizo or any of that crap. That way people are comfortable going back to their indigenous roots, and then discrimination ends. So that's just my 2 cents. This othering of mixed blood natives is both counterproductive and quite frankly rooted in colonialist thinking. By embracing mestizo as a legitimate term, we validate a racist system. Now, do mixed blood natives in Mexico hold positions of social privilege? Of course they do. The entire Mexican social system was set up to work that way. That's the problem with colonialism. It's super shitty, but this isn't Mexico. And believe me when I say that U.S. racist institutions don't care how much indigenous blood you carry or whether you grew up traditional. As we can see from the examples I gave earlier, mixed blood or full-blooded an Indian is an Indian, and Indians are the enemy. I don't think that promoting a racial caste system implemented by the Spanish is the best way to go about decolonization. Rather, I agree with the indigenous scholar Jack Forbes, who said to be a mestizo is to cop out. It is to accept the Spanish colonialist, racist ideology. It is to fall supine before the Europeans' racial grading system instead of struggling for psychological liberation. It is to deny one's own people history in order to have a masochistic, obscene relationship with the invaders and conquerors. 3, it suggests that there is only one authentic indigenous experience in the Americas despite colonialist oppression taking many forms. The simple fact is that there is no singular indigenous experience. The violence endured by indigenous people across the American continent has taken many forms, as have our lived experiences under such violence. Using indigenous identity as a weapon to attack and silence Native people who are struggling to reclaim their own identities, usually by claiming they are less than or unworthy of being indigenous simply because they have experienced colonialism differently, is a dead-end strategy. I absolutely Kurly, you make a really excellent point here, and it goes in line with what Nua Mauta said in one of our videos, that people think to be indigenous, you have to be in this little box. You have to fit everything to a T in this little box. And if you're outside this little box, you're not indigenous, which is crazy. It's stupid. It's really not logical. Like, don't get me wrong. I have respect for tribes that are traditional in Mexico. I have a lot of respect for them. But this type of logic is not applied to other races. People that are Black don't have to grow up in an African community speaking an African language in Africa in order to be Black. They're still Black at the end of the day. Same thing with Asians. Same thing with any other racial group. It is only applied to us. And it's so obvious that it's a tool to just disenfranchise us as the original inhabitants of this land. It's a tool to divide us. It is so extremely obvious, but it is lost on so many people. I don't know if it's just purposeful intellectual dishonesty or stupidity. I honestly don't know. But anyways, in reality, some full-blooded natives cannot speak their language. There are adopted natives with no way to reconnect with their traditions. There are mixed-blood natives who are looking for a way to reconnect with their culture. Some natives are born-again Christians, atheists, Muslims, and those who keep traditional ways. Natives who grew up in well-off families, natives who grew up broke, natives who go to college, natives who drop out of high school. There are some natives who have communities to go home to, and some natives who have no idea where they belong to. We all have different lived experiences as indigenous people, and all of these experiences are valid. To suggest otherwise is surrendering to colonialism. Absolutely. To suggest that because other people have gone through different experiences that they're no longer indigenous, that the blood they have doesn't matter anymore, that is sealing erasure. That is doing the conquistadors' work of assimilation, forced assimilation for people. That's all you're doing. You're not, and me and Marcus are going to get into this later on, but we see a lot of this argument that Kurly's talking about comes from a lot of liberal people that on the left that think that they are white knights in shining armor, that they're great defenders or something, but you're really just pests, and you're really pro-conquistador enforcers. That's what you are. But we're going to rip into y'all later on in another video. Trust me on that. We are going to rip into y'all. In a recent blog post attacking Chicano identity, Indigeneity, author Jessica Hernandez stated, "It is as though everyone wants some indigeneity to claim without having to face the threats and violence that comes from it. First, claiming that Chicana-Chicanos have not experienced threats and violence due to their indigeneity is not only ahistorical, it is so tone deaf that I wonder if the author knows anything about Chicana-Chicano history at all. Secondly, making suffering a prerequisite of Indigenous identity is a bit too sadistic for my taste. Shouldn't we be working together to end the suffering of Indigenous people as a whole rather than making it a defining characteristic of indigeneity? I agree. Again, it goes back to the root causes. This woman, Jessica Hernandez, like, again, are you going to apply a particular oppression or suffering for another racial group to be erased? I really don't think you would. I really don't think you would. I think you're just being obtuse, purposely obtuse. Again, tackling the root cause is the whole notion that we are separate and better because we're mixed. We need to erase that. Now, do not take me out of context. That does not mean when I say that we are not, that we're all the same. That doesn't mean that tribal sovereignty goes out the window or that everyone just joins a tribe they have no ancestry in. No, of course not. Tribal sovereignty will always be respected with tribes that exist. And those tribes can determine if they want their descendants that are not part of the tribe to return or not. That is their right, right? But there's plenty of Indigenous people, mixed natives or whatever, that their tribes no longer exist. So those people should be able to retribalize and bring those back if possible, be able to preserve the culture, traditions, the history that's still left. And even without a tribe, you can still be Indigenous. That doesn't mean, just because you're Indigenous, that doesn't mean you're Guachichil. Just because you're Indigenous, you're saying you're Indigenous, does not mean you're Raramuri or Mayan. Those are specific identities within the realm of being Indigenous. Those are basically nationhoods, right? Because I've had that compared by Northern Natives. A tribe is a nation. Those are basically, in my opinion, nationalities, right? They're very specific. So just as how I couldn't go to Brazil and say I'm a Brazil citizen because I'm Latino or whatever, right? Okay, that wouldn't work. It's the same concept. Just because you're saying you're Indigenous does not mean you suddenly are encroaching on, the Guachichil and saying you're Guachichil. Two very separate things. You can be Indigenous, you can be a race without a tribe. So I wanted to make that point clear before somebody attacks me on that. 4, it conflates asserting an Indigenous identity with laying claim to membership in a specific community. Holy crap! Like I should have just read this. I'm sorry, Kurly. I guess you have a great mind, and I think a little bit alike, like you. All right, so look, there's a huge difference between identifying as Indigenous and claiming to be Hopi, Zuni, Navajo, etc. My ancestors were Nahuas from the states of Mexico and Puebla, but I did not grow up in a traditional Nahua community. Does that mean that I can claim membership in a Nahua community? No, of course not. Not unless that community recognizes me as a member. But does that mean that I am not Indigenous? I find the question itself to be absurd because, of course, I'm Indigenous. I'm an Indigenous man of Nahua descent. This reality may not resonate with those who argue against Chicana-Chicano identity, and that is fine. But just know this: we do not need anyone's permission to be who we are. In fact, if anything, these misguided attacks on Chicana-Chicano identity have led to a resurgence in Chicana-Chicano pride. Yeah. 100% agreed. 100% agreed. 5, it perpetuates Indigenous lateral oppression. Ultimately, the idea that some Native people are authentically Indigenous while others are merely of Indigenous descent is fundamentally flawed. It suggests that colonialism is both permanent and irreversible, and that any effort to reclaim what has been lost due to colonialization is pointless and futile. It is a misguided idea that denies Indigenous people the agency to determine their own identities in the way that is meaningful and empowering. When we accept the authentically Indigenous versus of Indigenous descent argument, we actively participate in the very program of Indigenous extermination that began with Spanish colonization. And even worse, we are doing it to each other. As Gerald Tayaki, Alfred, and Jeff Contossel have eloquently observed, this disconnection from our lands, cultures, and communities has led to social suffering and the destruction of families. And yet, the real deprivation is the erosion of an ethic of universal respect and responsibility that used to be the hallmark of Indigenous societies. Indigenous lateral oppression is when Native people exhibit toxic, harmful, and hostile behavior towards one another. As long as proponents of the Indigenous descendant argument continue to dismiss the lived experience of Chicana-Chicanos by writing us off as mestizos, half-breeds, and refuse to recognize our right to determine our identities, they are perpetuating Indigenous lateral oppression. I can't bring myself to participate in such self-destructive behavior. My enemies are not my own people. I remain defiantly Indigenous. And he lists further suggested reading for everybody here. Excellent, excellent, excellent article. When I was, when I first started my decolonization journey, my, searching for my roots, I ran across this. Shout out to Fidel Garcia and Jose Garcia for sending me this article way back then. It was really good. So excellent, excellent article. And me and Marcus will probably go over Jessica Hernandez's article in the future too, and just to pick it apart. I just wanted to add one thing is like, if I would have just bought this whole horse shit about Mestizaje, I would have never made the effort through the genealogy to find my tribe. I spent probably around 700 hours doing genealogy to find my tribe. 700 hours. I charge for genealogy nowadays. I mean, I have a little bit of a business. I'll do services, right? But I charge like 25 an hour, which is pretty, like, that's a little low for some genealogy. A lot of genealogists charge 35 to 75. But if you do the math on that shit, like, I like the amount of professional work is I've reached that level, I would say, because I'm very knowledgeable on how to do genealogy. I did about 17 grand worth of work on my own tree to find my stuff. Had I bought the whole mestizo bullshit, I would have never done that. I would have never found my community, and they still exist, and they accepted me with all their heart, right? They thought it was a gift, me coming back. And I'm visiting them in September too for an anniversary celebration. So, but if I had bought this crap that Jessica Hernandez and people like her wanted to throw in there, I would have never found my tribe. I would have never reconnected and become a member, right? So don't listen to people like that. They're just nonsense. It's just complete garbage. But anyways, guys, thank you for tuning in. And Kurly, again, thank you for what you do. You are excellent. We'd like to have you on the podcast in the future soon. But yeah, I'll keep listening to yours. Everyone, please follow him. Tales from Atlantis. My bad. Tales from Atlantis. He's on Spotify. He's on a crap load of platforms, honestly. I just listen to him from Spotify. But really good guy. Thank you again, everybody, for everything.